Thursday, the 31st of December, 2020. So we only have a few hours left of this annus horribilis. As listeners will have noticed, we will be conducting this episode in English because the guest star is Mark Littlewood, who is Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. And we will be talking about Brexit and a free market, libertarian, classical liberal argument for leaving the European Union, which Mark Littlewood is in favor of, and I'm in opposition to his view, so we can have a discussion about that. Mark, welcome to this podcast. Thank you very much for joining me. You are joining from a hotel room in Tenerife. How did you get there?
Got here just in time, really. Often I go away with my partner at this time of year. We're very rarely in London for Christmas and New Year. So we booked this some time ago, but we actually got out, I think it was about 24 hours before the London lockdown would have prevented international travel other than for emergencies. And I don't think I could have claimed that going on holiday to Tenerife was an emergency. But having got here, it's great. It's the hotel is gorgeous, but largely empty. So social distancing is extremely easy. And the restaurants and the bars are open, unlike in London. So I may be staying here for some considerable time.
Yeah. Just a brief comment before we start. So you're saying about 15% full is the hotel?
Yeah, something like that. And this hotel it's a very large hotel. It's largely dependent on British tourists. I would say considerably more than half of the people here are British tourists. So we may very well have been the last arrivals a week before Christmas. Right. So people are going home, but nobody from the United Kingdom is arriving. So the staff to guest ratio is improving ever more in our favour with each passing day.
But what I find striking is that you told me that all the restaurants, there are 8 restaurants in the hotel, and all the restaurants are still open. It's
that's right.
Kind of interesting. I'm pretty sure if that was a sort of state-run monopoly, they would have shut down 7 of the restaurants and said, sorry, guys, we got to...
That might be right. Of course, the great advantage you have here that we don't have in Copenhagen or in London is there are still quite strict rules here in Tenerife about COVID. You need to wear a face mask in public if you're not eating or drinking. But because the weather here is so good, it's about 23 or 24 degrees every day. Everything's outside. So you're not allowed to eat inside in restaurants, but everybody's dining al fresco anyway. But I'm guessing in Copenhagen and London at the moment, dining outside would not be a particularly pleasant experience.
No, it wouldn't. Not at all. Mark, let's get to it. Brexit. In March 2016, you wrote an op-ed for, I think it was The Telegraph, that ran the headline, "I used to love the EU, now I want Britain to leave."
Yep.
So tell me about that personal journey of yours. How did you get
initially,
to that position?
and going back, let's say 20 years, I wasn't just fond of the European Union. I was a real enthusiast for it. In fact, my first job after leaving university and law school was working for an organization called the European Movement, a pro-European organization.
I used to be a member of the executive committee of the Danish European Movement.
There you go. And on very classical liberal grounds, I was extremely attracted to the European project. I thought that things that removed barriers, facilitated trade, made it simplicity to mutually recognized qualifications, making sure that a Danish driving license was okay to drive a car in the United Kingdom and vice versa.
Even though you're driving the wrong side of the road, Mark.
Yeah. So even though we drive on the wrong side of the road, but we think that you Danes and other Europeans are probably competent enough to realise that if you get behind the wheel of a motor vehicle in the UK. So it appealed to me as a framework for breaking down barriers to trade, basically, and liberating people and businesses across an expanding geographical area, of course, from an initial 6 to right up to now 27. All of that appealed to me. But over time, and this is a contingent point, I don't believe there's a principled reason for classical liberals to support or oppose the European Union in principle. I don't think there's a theoretical right or wrong from a classical liberal perspective. But over time, I became increasingly concerned that the European Union was not a federal project, but was increasingly a centralisation project, and was coming up with ever more strident regulation to enforce uniformity, rather than, if you like, setting a floor and allowing considerable flexibility for each member state to pursue its own objectives. Now, in the UK, that's often been overstated, I think, that sort of 80% of our laws come from Brussels. And even if that was true in quantum, it's not true in impact. You know, we have the power to set our own tax rates. We have a lot of regulatory flexibility. But nevertheless, from a liberal free market perspective, I was seeing less and less about the European Union that I liked. I think especially with regard to regulation, that was becoming more and more intrusive and almost petty, that it was no longer broad sweeping rules about, let's say, the free movement of people. It was directives about the exact size and nature of a health warning on a packet of cigarettes, or how quickly the standby button needs to switch off your television set if you haven't, hit a button on it for 2 hours in order to save the planet from climate change, or the maximum suction power of a vacuum cleaner. I mean, these are extraordinary regulations for a centralised bureaucracy to be imposing, rather than the broad sweep of facilitating trade amongst the member states. And worse still, I think its ability to open up trade to the 93% of the human race who don't live in the European Union has been pretty poor. Not absolutely catastrophic. The EU does have trade agreements with other parts of the world, but poor. So from a global free trading point of view, I increasingly reached the view that the European Union was in danger of becoming something of a racket, a protectionist racket to prop up industries in Western Europe. So it was a balanced decision. It was over a long period of time that I changed my mind. I liked the single market idea in the early 1990s, but I think that it's become the EU's mindset has been increasingly a drive to uniformity, almost for uniformity's own sake. And that Brexit therefore provided a chance, not a guarantee by any means, but a chance to shake this up a bit and bring a bit of regulatory competition, and let's see how that works out. I think actually it will be good for the EU to have a fairly major economy on its doorstep that can diverge from its decisions, and we can do so in a perfectly friendly way. So I'm quite excited about it, but I'm not certain about it. And one of the things that has frustrated me in the British debate has been a bit too much certainty on both sides of the argument. Those who wanted to stay in the EU would have us believe that it would be a sort of economic apocalypse if we left, and was in some of them almost sort of suggesting that it suggests a sort of narrow-minded nationalism or almost a racism to even contemplate doing so. And some who were the most ardent supporters of leave believe that this was a moment of national salvation that is sort of certain to lead to the rebirth of the United Kingdom as an incredibly prosperous and powerful country. Neither of those are true. I think it's a much more marginal decision.
That's interesting. That resonates with me in general. Over the recent years, I've been more and more persuaded of the idea that most decisions are not, 100-0 or 90-10 decisions where 90% of the evidence weighs in one direction and only 10% weighs in the other. And what I hear you saying, this is kind of maybe a 60-40 position for decision for you, that on balance you have 60% saying yes, I want to leave, and 40% saying maybe staying in would have been better. Is that correct?
I think that's probably that's about right. I mean, the way I looked at it, when going back to, I think, almost that Telegraph article, I'm not sure I referenced it in that article, but my thought process was, if the UK stayed in the European Union, we were probably sort of more or less guaranteed a 6 out of 10 future, not too bad, bit above average.
Yeah.
If we left the European Union, the range of possible outcomes for the United Kingdom widened enormously. And you could imagine a scenario, now we are leaving, as we're speaking now, in just we'll be completely out in just a few hours' time, having gone through the transition period for 2020. But the range of possible futures for the UK is now probably anything between a 4 out of 10 and a 9 out of 10. And I'm not sure where we'll end up on that spectrum. I can imagine, I'm open-minded to imagining the UK government over the next 5, 10, 15 years taking a series of such disastrous policy and strategic decisions that I end up regretting our departure from the European Union. That would be at the 4 end of the spectrum. But if you're going to have a little bit of optimism, which I appreciate has been in rather short supply in the year 2020, then I think if you get a number of things right, our future could easily be a sort of an 8 or a 9 out of 10. So I guess on the one hand, I kind of thought staying in was a 6, leaving could be anything between a 4 and a 9. But if you add 4 and 9 together and halve them, you get 6.5. So on balance, leave, I think, is worth the gamble. But it is a gamble. It is a gamble. There's no doubt about that.
So it's the risk averse response would be to stay in, and the sort of I wouldn't say risk loving, but risk willing response would be, let's try this and see what we can do with it. So in that sense, and I agree with you there. So in that sense, Danes should be thankful that the British are taking this risk for them and sort of showing us what is possible outside the European Union. And, if it goes well, we could consider doing the same. And if it goes badly, maybe we shouldn't. So in that sense, you're doing us a favor.
Yeah, we offered to be the guinea pigs.
That's right.
For any other member state who might consider departure, I guess.
But of course, in another sense, you are doing us a disfavor because you've left the alliance of relatively sort of classical liberal free market countries that don't want the European Union to be too centralized. They don't want the European Union to have its own taxes. They want spending to be, not increasing too quickly, etc. And we're having a harder time now negotiating that. We have a European Union that is less market friendly, that is more hostile to the financial sector, for instance. There's a risk that we'll get, taxes on financial transactions and all this kind of stuff in the European Union. So that's a risk factor as well, that the European Union, with Britain having, within a few hours, having left the Union, and we're recording this on the last day of 2020, so it's happening now, and how would you balance in that risk that the European Union, which is very close to you, it's in your interest that the Union does well, that the Union will do poorly with Britain outside? What's your take on that?
That is a fair argument, and in fact, our former academic and research director at the IEA, Professor Philip Booth, who voted for Remain, one of his key arguments was, he didn't quite concede, I'm putting words in his mouth, but he sort of said, look, it might not be particularly good for the United Kingdom to stay in, but we should be more altruistic than that. It would be very good for the European Union if we stayed in, because we would keep it anchored in a slightly more classical liberal free market direction than it otherwise would be the case. And if you are an altruistic person, that should weigh with you. We should be helping people like Martin and Sipos in Denmark rather than just sort of exiting stage left. I can see that argument, and I think it likely that on balance, probably not enormously so, but the EU will become a rather more statist, social democratic, rather less classical liberal in aggregate than it would be if the United Kingdom was round the table. Against that, however, and I appreciate there is no proof here, this is a leap of faith, a guess, an assertion. Yes. If the UK outside practices classical liberal policies, or at least to a greater degree than the European Union, and if those are shown to be successful, then I guess you and I, Martin, and people of our mindset are a great believer that competition, drives replication. And perhaps rather than being it would probably be unfair to say we were an unwelcome member of the European Union, but we were always slightly, by our own design, sort of sitting on the sidelines, complaining about everything, and sort of so we don't really like this, we don't really like that, and we're sort of slowing down some of the tendencies of other European Union states rather than actually driving the agenda. Perhaps it would be better for classical liberal Danes and others in the European Union who want a more classical liberal EU to actually have a classical liberal UK on the outside, successfully competing, if we were to go down that path, and showing that there shouldn't be a financial transactions tax, for example, that we don't need to regulate the exact suction power of a vacuum cleaner, for example. And if the practice of classical liberalism in an independent United Kingdom is shown to work, leads to greater prosperity, higher growth, then presumably there is a chance that that will edge the EU in that direction rather more than us being a sort of slightly sitting on the sidelines around the table and rolling our eyes and whinging about the general direction of the EU. So if you consider the possible dynamic effect if Britain gets it right, that could be win-win. It could actually, over the medium term, encourage the European Union to replicate a slightly more free market model, if indeed we go down that path, and if it's shown to be successful on the EU's doorstep.
I agree, and that's institutional competition, and that's a very very important concept. I think that most people discussing international politics don't take into account. So I agree with you there. But how do you think, looking at what's been happening over the last 4 years or so since you wrote that article, what is your take on? Is this the direction Britain is heading in with the current government and the current prime minister? Isn't there a discussion of introducing a wealth tax, for instance?
No, sure. I mean, look, it would be, having given that glorious sort of introduction to how libertarian utopia in the United Kingdom in the coming years is going to be the shining beacon that the rest of you will follow. Clearly, it's not anything like as binary as that. My audit of this government would be mixed. I think probably on balance, its impulses are more in a classical liberal direction than the average mean or median of the EU as a whole. So all things are relative. I'm not giving the Boris Johnson government a kind of 10 out of 10 or even a 9 or an 8. But it might be that I would give it a sort of 6.5 compared to giving the EU a 3 or a 4.
Right. So what is Boris Johnson doing that's pulling that up currently?
Part of it is actually what he's not doing, right? So okay. What do you think the likely trajectory is going to be of regulation in the EU over the next 5 or 10 years? And for example, although he's made no concrete pledges, he's a man who speaks in very broad brushstrokes in terms of his views. Just a few days ago, he was saying, right, well, Britain now has a great opportunity in financial services, bioscience, and artificial intelligence to really pursue our own framework for developing those. Now, he didn't get into detail, but I would say one could speculate that it would be pretty likely that in those areas, financial services, biosciences, and artificial intelligence, we will regulate those relatively lightly compared to the European Union. Again, that's a guess, it's not a certainty, but I would say if you look at where the cards are presently sitting, Boris Johnson's government and the sort of UK's attitude and approach to these things is likely to mean, even if we don't get everything absolutely bang on optimum from a kind of purist libertarian perspective, that we will probably regulate those in a lighter touch sort of fashion, encouraging innovation rather than precaution.
Isn't that just one way of interpreting what he's saying there? Because I'm also seeing in the public debate in Britain, I don't follow it as closely as you, obviously, but I do read the papers sometimes and The Economist, etc. And what I tend to see is a lot of people saying, well, now that Britain is leaving, this gives us freedom to pursue industrial policy, like in the good old days, where we subsidize industry and get industrial production back, and that will be good for the north and for regions struggling. And we also need to have much more Keynesian stimulus, and that's possible now that the Germans and the European Central Bank isn't running to a large extent our macroeconomic policy.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of it does free Britain, but to move in which direction? And what he was saying there could be interpreted as him saying these are the sectors that we want to focus on, and we'll do that by subsidizing them or protecting them from competition or whatever it is. What is your take on that? What is your sense that Britain is moving in that direction, or am I wrong there?
I mean, that's where my worries lie. The benefits, to my mind, where I'm feeling quite confident, is that at least in terms of the flow of regulation, if not the stock, I don't think we're going to actually repeal much of EU regulation. That will just sit on the stocks. We may tamper with it a bit, but in terms of the flow of regulation, I think we'll get right. I think our trade policy is likely to be more liberal. But you're quite right, Martin. I mean, a danger of giving any country, just with any individual, greater freedom is they might use that freedom incredibly stupidly. And there is a danger that unshackled from the state aid rules, we now have the power, which our politicians have suddenly rediscovered, to bail out or subsidize their particular, which would have been circumscribed by EU law. That power is now in our hands, and it might be, there is a risk that we will use our newfound sovereignty to do stupid things rather than sensible things. And I think you are correct to point out, I think it's an important point and a sobering point for liberal Brexiteers such as myself, that if you were to look at the sweeping narrative as a whole, there is a danger that we will move down the state aid route, that we want to sort of build new businesses in the northeast of England to particularly help areas that the ruling Conservative Party surprisingly won at the last election and wish to keep. It's possible we'll go down that route, and it's possible too that we won't seize a good number of the opportunities that, to my mind, should be open and shut. I mean, an argument I've put to British cabinet ministers here is, I wasn't of the view that we should leave the EU on a particular hour and all EU law is immediately rescinded. But I think we should go through it with a tooth comb and try and work out, do we really want to keep this? Do we want to rescind this? Do we want to amend this? Rather than just assuming that we've inherited the perfect regulation. And my starting point would be to say that anything that we've inherited from the European Union that was passed by qualified majority voting with the United Kingdom in opposition, surely those regulations should be on the chopping block. I mean, an example of that would be the agency workers and part-time worker directive. The Cameron government opposed this. It was passed by QMV. I haven't heard anybody in the hierarchy of the Conservative Party or the government saying that the British government's changed its mind. So if that was a rule that was imposed upon us against our better judgment, surely that should be rescinded. So you're right, there's a worry that we'll start pulling state aid levers and we won't use the levers that are available to us. In fact, I was saying to a friend of mine just a couple of days ago, that my worry is that this reminds me a bit of a scene from the Monty Python movie, The Meaning of Life. In this Monty Python movie, Graham Chapman plays a rather pompous Protestant who is whimsically reflecting upon all of the great freedoms he has to do naughty, titillating or sexy things because he's a Protestant and not a Catholic. However, he doesn't do any of these things. He just reflects that he has the freedom to do these things. And there probably is a danger that the UK falls into the similar trap. We sort of pat ourselves on the back that we can now design our regulations as we wish or get rid of EU laws that we were always opposed to. But just to pompously think that without doing it would be to miss the great Brexit opportunity. So I'm not certain everything will go well. It is a risk. certainly a lot of things it's argued that Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party would have wanted to do, had they prevailed at the last election, would effectively have been circumscribed by EU law. That's no longer the case if we choose to elect a very, very socialist interventionist government. That is what we will get. So the breadth and the width of possible outcomes has widened, and definitely includes things which would be worse than continued EU membership. I still think, on balance, that the broad views, at least of this government, on balance, are just in the direction of not having too heavy-handed regulations, not taxing too much. They're nothing like as liberal as I'd like them to be. I think the COVID pandemic has also brought out authoritarian instincts in people who would otherwise have been considered sympathetic to a fairly free market liberal program.
Everywhere, Mark.
Everywhere, that's true.
It's been terrible, yeah.
But nevertheless, on balance, I think that we will do some stupid things, but overall more sensible things.
I guess the central point. I guess the central point here is that many people don't realize, certainly not in the Danish debate, is how Britain will do hasn't really got that much to do with whether Britain is a member of the European Union or not. I agree with you completely that this 4 to 9 interval is absolutely correct. Many countries are doing very well outside the European Union. Switzerland is doing great. It's more wealthy than we are. Singapore is far away. It would be strange to have them as member of the European Union, but it's certainly an example of a country that's very prosperous. It's not a country I would love to live in because of the other issues. Culture, democracy, personal freedom is not that great, but they're certainly economically doing well. So the European Union is just one path to success for countries, and there are other paths, and that's very, very important to realize. I think this is such an important point. I really do, because one of the things which I was alluding to earlier, Martin, that's infuriated me about the debate has been the absolutism on each side, as if whether one's membership of the European Union or not is the overarching defining thing about everything that happens to you. And, I suspect overall, not a great deal is going to change, that in 2 or 3 years' time, I would like to think we'll be modest. We would have made modestly better or less stupid decisions than the EU's made. But I don't necessarily think it's going to be transformative. I think, however, if I'm right on that this is a more marginal overall decision than most people would allow. That's quite an important. Insight from a classical liberal perspective. That too often people sort of think that the world we live in is defined entirely by our institutional structures. And as I mentioned earlier, although I wouldn't want to tar all supporters of the Remain campaign here with this brush, even a kind of liberal approach to multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism and internationalism was sort of saying, oh, you've got to support our membership of the EU then. Why? I mean, my support for anti-racism and being open to people of all different cultures, it does not find its expression through the European Union Council of Ministers or some bureaucratic department in the European Commission. So I think what might be an interesting outcome of this from a classical liberal perspective is if nothing much changes, it would at least show that the emperor has no clothes, that it's actually not that important whether you're in the European Union or not, and that the claims made by the European Union that it's a kind of its bureaucratic and institutional structures are fundamental and necessary for preserving peace in Europe or for maintaining reasonable levels of prosperity. I think that bureaucratic class is going to be in for a shock, because even if the UK doesn't get up to the 8s or 9s out of 10 that I'd like it to, I don't think we're going to, I don't think the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and the plague of locusts is about to arrive in the UK. And it may just illustrate, even if the argument will go on and on and on about whether the counterfactual, would we have been better off if we'd stayed in, if in fact there isn't much difference. If it's not completely obvious
then that of itself is potentially a win for those of us who are somewhat skeptical about the extent to which bureaucratic institutional structures are the things that determine our opportunities and prosperity.
Right, and I guess there's an opposite argument to that, which is that you might also find that a lot of the freedom that a lot of people expect to get out of leaving the European Union is maybe a bit of an illusion as well, because if you want to trade with Europe, to some extent, you'll have to accept the rules, maybe not as part of a qualified majority vote that you lose, but as a fact of life. This is just the way we have to do things, and that's part of the argument for staying in. That Switzerland and Norway also have to comply with the rules of the European Union, so it's better to be inside, having a say on what those rules are going to look like, than sitting outside and having to accept them. What's your take on that argument?
That again is a contingent argument. A similar case could be made that we should, in the UK, apply to become the 51st state of the USA. It is true that we presently trade more with the European Union than we do with the USA, although the USA is a
But that's also
country.
Institutional. As you know, I guess that's one of the things that a lot of people don't realize, that they look at what would happen if we leave the European Union. Well, that's terrible because we would lose our major trading partners. Well, we have a flexible economy. We have businesses. I mean, COVID, if anything, has shown how flexible businesses can be. They can convert within days from producing one product to producing something else. And businesses can convert from exporting to one exporting partner to another. So if you have a flexible free market economy, you're very likely to exaggerate the costs of institutional changes.
Yes, I think
because business will adapt to the new circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's almost certainly true. So what this hinges on, and you're quite right. I mean, obviously, if we wish to continue, which we do, to sell products and services into the European Union single market, those products and services have to comply with European Union single market rules. But I've never considered that to be much of a revelation. I mean, stuff that we sell into the American market has to comply with American rules. Stuff that we sell into the Singaporean market has to comply with Singaporean rules. None of those are reasons why we should, none of those are compelling reasons why we should seek to share a regulatory institutional structure with the United States of America or with Singapore or with Australia. And it's why I'm quite interested in how we approach trade deals going forward. The Secretary of State for Trade here, Liz Truss, is a very classical liberal free market buccaneer, a good friend of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thus far, in truth, we haven't done a great deal more than just succeed in rolling on what the EU arrangement was. We've done a bit better than that with Japan. I think there's every chance that we will actually apply to join the CPTPP, the Common and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership that already has 10 or 11 members in it. So we might join other free trade areas. Now, I don't want to fall into the trap of saying that trade requires free trade deals and it's all about the treaty signed between governments. It isn't. But this might be as good a way of influencing the regulatory environment around the world by sitting across the table with the Australians, with the Japanese, with the EU, with the Americans, with the Canadians, with the Turks, and saying, look, hang on a second, these barriers that you've got against our motor car industry, insurance industry, or whatever, you've got to surely lower these and we'll lower them in return. That might actually be a better dynamic force for spreading a liberal approach to trade and regulation than it is to have a seat round the table in the Council of Ministers or 70 MEPs in the European Parliament. Not certain that it is, but not certain that it isn't. Right. The UK is still, the 5th largest economy in the world. And if we use our influence in the WTO and through bilateral trade agreements, let alone the influence that we might have in any trade blocs we join, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it could well turn out that that is a better way of the UK not just defending its own interests or spreading liberalism than it is to have a seat round the table, as it's called, which is always, I think, again, a very bureaucratic institutional way of looking at it. You want a seat round the table. Well, which table? I mean, we're still going to sit round tables and talk to people. Why do I need a particular seat in your particular bureaucratic and institutional structure? Why is it I need a particular seat at this particular meeting of the EU Council of Ministers? Not necessarily so. The seat that I might want round the table is facing you eye to eye in the way that Lord David Frost, our chief negotiator, did with Michel Barnier, the EU's chief negotiator. And worth saying there, I think, in terms of the broad content of the deal, that's far, I think it's far better for the United Kingdom than the renegotiation conducted by David Cameron's government, where we had a seat round the table, but we were unable to extract any meaningful concessions from the European Union at all. In terms of the things that we wanted and the liberalisations we wanted, it was only when we said, okay, we're getting divorced, that we actually started to get some of those, some movement there, and have ended up with a deal which is remarkably similar. I mean, I would say almost identical to a plan that the IEA put forward in 2018. We call it Plan A+. The text, well, obviously the text of the final deal is written in legalese. Ours is a think tank pamphlet, but are
you saying that the Brexit deal that has just been passed is similar to what you proposed back? When was this? Oh, interesting. We'll link to that document. I think
in 2018, yeah, we released a document called Plan A+.
Okay.
Again, we had said the IEA took no position on leave or remain, but we said if we are going to leave, what would the most free market arrangement look like?
Okay. So that's another interesting thing. That, by the way, I think to many listeners who don't know exactly how a think tank works. So you took a position as the sort of the CEO of. Your title is Director General, but it's the same thing. As CEO of the IEA, you took a personal position, but that didn't mean that the IEA took a institutional position.
Exactly right. We don't actually take an institutional position on any policy.
Neither do we, but it's very hard for people to understand that. If I go out and say something, they assume that it's
the position. But I mean, most oftentimes we would find that the IEA staff and trustees and associated academics would be in broad agreement. I can't think of anybody at the IEA who thinks that the tax burden should go up, for example. But there are a range of issues upon which we genuinely disagree. And in fact, we polled the IEA staff in a secret ballot at the time of the referendum. And we didn't just give leave or remain as options. We said, you're definitely going to vote leave, or you're probably going to vote leave. Do you not know? You're probably going to vote remain. You're definitely going to vote remain. But if you split just down into those indicating they were for leave and those indicating they were for remain, I think it was about 55%, maybe 60% for leave, and about 35% for remain. So we were on balance more Brexity than the country as a whole, but not enormously so.
Oh, and I believe there was a televised debate between you and one of your employees where you disagreed.
Right. Diego Zulaga, who was on our staff at the time, very passionately for Remain, and on referendum night itself, the two guests for a debate on CNN, it was actually, on College Green, which is, we went over to College Green, which is the large patch of grass just opposite Parliament, sat in CNN's tent, and Diego and I went hammer and tongs about it. Even though I was his boss, he's perfectly entitled to express a different view. Both of us were arguing from a classical liberal perspective. Right. It's just we reached different conclusions about what the most desirable outcome was. And I think it's healthy for think tanks to have those internal debates. We're not political parties, we're not governments. It doesn't matter if we're divided, if there's a genuine point of intellectual disagreement. I think having that discussion and debate in public is to be encouraged.
I agree, and we have many discussions like that at CBOS as well. I've never actually been in a televised debate with an employee on a subject where we disagreed. I'd love to do it, but the occasion hasn't occurred yet. Anyway, let's get back to to Brexit. So there's one argument that I find somewhat compelling, which is that we are facing a world now where China is, gaining strength. A lot of countries are very reluctant to stand up against sort of some of the illiberal tendencies that comes out of China, and in order for us to, in order for liberal democracy to, fight for the advancement of liberal democracy in the world, the liberal democracies need to stand together, and the European Union is an important platform for that. What's your take on that?
I think I agree with all of that, apart from the last few words. That liberal democracies need to stand together. I agree with that. I'm a strong believer in a kind of what has become an increasingly amorphous Western alliance. I think NATO is now a less important part of the Western alliance than it was at the time of the Cold War, when there was an existential threat from communism and the threat of all-out nuclear war. So I would like to find mechanisms in which Western liberal countries can club together, try and coordinate their actions on the international stage. What I'm not persuaded of is that the EU is a particularly good example of that. I don't think it has succeeded in that regard. It's not even particularly obvious to me that it should strive to place that within its competence. I mean, the European Union, I don't mean this in a dismissive way, is an inward-looking operation. It's to try and ensure that things flow smoothly within Western Europe initially, and then the wider continent of Europe, that conflict is avoided, that we don't go to war again, having done that twice in the 20th century. Fine, great. But has it shown, does it have the competence, the capacity, the ability to stand up to China? It seems to me that would be an area in which its reach and its grasp would be rather, its reach would be considerably greater than its grasp.
I would agree, but what institution does have that? I mean, wouldn't the European Union be the best bet for an institution that could develop that? I'm not sure. I want to hear your opinion about it.
Well, I think you emphatically need the United States of America involved in such. If you believe in the Western Alliance, that's basically what we're talking about, isn't it? I mean, okay, you can add on Australia and New Zealand, I guess, but we're principally talking about Europe plus the USA. So, I mean, I don't have a blueprint ready for you about what that should look like. But if one were to just ponder things entirely hypothetically, should we remake NATO into that sort of operation? NATO still has essentially, because it was designed for the Cold War, it's still sort of in that framework. Maybe NATO needs to be more of the mechanism for engagement with China, not pointing all of our nuclear weapons at China necessarily, but engagement with China. Or, I mean, I would, I despair at the United Nations. I mean, really, I'm not necessarily an abolitionist, because I think having an institution in which people can talk to each other probably has some benefit, but it obviously has no democratic legitimacy. Should there be some sort of League of Nations in which you can only join if you are, a democracy with basic respect for human rights, etc., etc., etc. I think every EU member state would qualify. The United States of America would qualify. Canada would qualify. Australia and New Zealand would qualify. Maybe we do need to build a different Western alliance. India? Couldn't say with certainty. Potentially, yes. I mean, it is a democracy. Yeah. At the margins, Turkey. I'm not sure exactly I'm not exactly sure where I'd draw the line. But if the principal aim was to get the Western alliance together, we definitely know who clearly, Denmark and the United Kingdom and the United States clearly qualify. So the question is, what sort of structure should we have? Not obvious to me that the European Union has a particularly interesting or competent role to play there. I think I'd probably want to reform NATO, recalibrate NATO, or set up some League of Democratic Nations as a sort of alternative to the UN, something of that sort of ilk. So my keenness for Brexit does not necessarily mean doesn't mean that I'm against international institutions per se. I'm not. I'm very interested in what alliances can be built in the WTO to tackle a lot of the problems with China. But I don't think that our present institutional constitutional frameworks are necessarily the appropriate ones. They were designed for the last war, if you like. I mean, almost literally,
Yes.
but metaphorically as well. So I think we just need to be a bit more adept at changing our institutional frameworks to adapt to different circumstances. And to be honest, the UN, the EU, and NATO haven't really done that. That's not to say that they should all just be eviscerated as institutions, but they haven't really shown an adaptability or flexibility, is certainly not at the level that I would have liked.
Okay. Let's return to Britain. You were the sarcasm, the underlying sarcasm at one point in what you were saying did not escape me when we were talking about, the risk that Britain would move in the wrong direction from, a prosperity perspective and also from a sort of value perspective, the way we see it. That you were saying, well, yes, freedom is always, that if you give people freedom, there's the risk that they make wrong decisions. And that's certainly true. And I guess we as sort of classical liberals do also think that states are not always comparable to individuals in that respect, that the freedom of states need to be, we need constitutions, we need to protect individual liberty. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that there are limits to what states can do. But on the other hand, I was wondering, what is it exactly that you find very compelling and important that Britain can do now that you couldn't do when you were in the European Union? I mean, you could have cut corporate taxes. You did cut corporate taxes.
We did cut
yes, you did. You could have, you were fairly free to regulate the city the way you wanted to, I think.
Yes. Again, I don't want to... I would like us to... the MiFID, which should never have been brought in or imposed, GDPR, all of the rules about data collection.
Right. Yes.
The problem with, if you like, regulatory freedom is I don't think I can point to 2 or 3 killer regulations that if we incinerated them or reformed them would suddenly add 10% to British GDP. They are all at an incredibly micro level, and only are add 0.0000001% to GDP.
Yes.
So
and similarly to sort of economic and personal freedom, it's each individual thing is.
And to my mind, it's actually more, which we've mentioned before, it's actually more about the flow than the stock. Right. I think that the stock of regulations that we now have across Europe is ridiculously burdensome. But to oversimplify here, generally speaking, businesses can adapt to the stock. If you bring in a regulation saying, for example, that absolutely every business with more than 2 stories must have 3 elevators in order to help people who aren't very mobile to get around the building. Let's say you brought in that sort of regulation. Well, within a few years, everybody's complied with it. Actually then repealing that regulation might help some new businesses, but basically everybody's complied. And even ongoing burdens like GDPR, quite upfront costs to train everybody about how to change all of your databases, but we've probably complied with it now. So I'm much more interested in the flow. Can
I just interrupt and we will get back to the flow? I agree with you to a certain extent, but there's a danger with the stock that it is not, you have a regulation that is not technology neutral, that sort of forces businesses to do things in a certain way so that new entrepreneurs, new innovations can't really enter the marketplace. New ideas can't be adopted because regulation forces people to do things in a certain way. And, if you have less innovation, you'll have less economic growth, you'll have less wealth. So I think the stock is important.
The stock matters. I wrote in the... just to prove I haven't been wholly idle while I've been here in Tenerife, Martin, I wrote in the Times on Monday in my fortnightly column, I applauded the Conservative member of the House of Lords, Matt Ridley, who has been banging the drum. He's also a scientist and
he's great, and he's a great author. I think I've read all his books.
And he's been saying that what we need, now I appreciate this is a concept rather than a list of specific regulations, but his view is in essence that the EU has overinterpreted the precautionary principle,
right,
that it has enshrined in its approach to regulation almost craven caution, that we should be biased in favor of the old against the new, that the standard that the new is held to is incredibly high and the standard that the old is held to isn't. And you get exactly that effect of kind of calcifying things and lacking innovation. His argument, this is not government policy, I should hasten to add, although he is a fairly influential thinker within the Conservative Party. His view is that we should not necessarily abolish the precautionary principle. It's important to ask questions before, drugs come to market. The thalidomide scandal is an example he gives. You can't just abolish everything. You need to ask, are we confident this is safe? But it needs to be complemented with an innovation principle. What will the impact of this new rule or regulation or directive or tax be on innovation, positive or negative? And if the answer is that it might very well be negative, then that should weigh as heavily as the precautionary principle. Now, I'm not saying that the UK will adopt that, but that's in the ferment of public discussion at the moment about whether we could just have that sort of rather different approach to regulation as a whole, rather than this really kind of almost extreme caution.
I think that's a very, very important insight, to have those two balancing principles, because that's what it's really about. It's about balancing different things you want to happen. Yep. So you want to be cautious, but you also want innovation to be possible. Yeah. And if you'd had regulation, back in the days, that would have made it impossible for penicillin to be invented. That would not have been precautionary. That would have been the opposite. Millions and millions of people would have died because of the precautionary principle if that had happened.
Yeah, and I think, as we speak now, even, there are questions. I'm not reaching any conclusions yet, and it's not my field of expertise, but there are questions about whether the regulation around rolling out the vaccine to COVID has perhaps been a bit too precautionary. Now, again, I'm not saying that you can just have one scientist saying, eureka, I've got the magic formula, and the next day it's available in pharmacies. But I think there is a question about whether we have been too cautious in rolling it out. And obviously, had we rolled it out earlier with, we're confident enough it will do, many people would have lived. So craven caution isn't necessarily the route to even protecting human life. So there is a trade-off. But at the moment, the approach has typically been only to look at the precaution side, not at the innovation side. And if you can begin to get that balance right, long way from it, not stated policy of the British government by any means, but if you begin to get that balance right, I think you're more likely to have a regulatory and legal framework that will encourage innovation rather more than we've typically been able to in Western Europe over the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah, interesting. So we came from a discussion of stock and flow. Do you want to say more about flow?
Well, I guess this would be the sort of flow question and direction. That it seems to me more likely than not certain, but more likely than not, that the EU will continue to regulate against innovatory procedures and science. I think that the EU regulations around genetic modification, for example, beyond the precautionary principle, just aren't scientific, are just bizarre. And even if I have to live with them forevermore because we're never going to get round to looking at the entire acquis communautaire, so everything we've inherited, good, bad, and indifferent, is going to stay on the books, I would imagine these sort of things in future, like artificial intelligence, for example, are likely to be heavy-handedly regulated by the European Union, and are less likely to be heavily regulated by the United Kingdom. Now, at the moment, I can't even get my head around what artificial intelligence could do for our society. I have half an idea, But the new stuff that's coming in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, it wouldn't amaze me if there's, there were even some sniffs of it. If there was an EU-wide directive to prevent Uber, for example. I know some that's generally being regulated at member state level. We've had some problems with that in London, but I think it would be a lot harder to ban Uber, something that 15 years ago we could not even conceived of existing in the UK than it would in the EU. I don't know what sort of biosciences or artificial intelligence is going to come up with over the next 15 or 20 years, but I'm concerned that the EU's regulatory environment will act as into dampening away on innovation and be too cautious. Yeah. And the UK is likely to be a more benign environment for innovation. It's a guess, it's a hope, it's a bit of a leap of faith, but I think there's some evidence for that.
Yeah, that'll be very interesting to follow. Let's return back to the stock of regulation. You mentioned a very interesting policy proposal earlier on, where you'd say, well, all the decisions, regulatory decisions made by qualified majority by the European Union that Britain voted against, let's start scrapping those. That's very easy to understand. Is that proposal gaining any traction in the British government?
I've raised it with cabinet ministers. I think that I think it could become the starting point for deregulating. Nobody has turned around to me and said, what a completely crazy idea, because it obviously has a certain logic to it, a certain democratic logic to it even, right? Why would we continue to abide by policies that we voted against? Pretty extraordinary. But the one, just to again to temper my Brexit optimism with your sober analysis, Martin, what we mustn't fall for, and I will share an anecdote, I won't name anybody because it was in a private meeting with a government minister, but it was like something out of the TV series, I don't know if it has any traction in Denmark, Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, which is a comedy. It has traction series
with me, Mark.
Right. It's a comedy series in which sort of shows the real power that the civil service and the bureaucrats.
We'll link to that as well for the people who...
Link to that as well. In fact, the person who wrote it was initially inspired by IA material about public choice theory. That's what gave him the idea to write it. So we can even influence committee. But there was one civil servant who said in a meeting I was at in the minister, he said, that sounds like a good idea. But you have to understand, Minister, on a good number of occasions, the British government has voted against things that it was actually in favour of, and has voted for things that it was actually against. As part of what I said, at this point, you've lost it, right? Why you've been doing that is beyond me. So I think it might be a good starting point. I think there were certain things, we're going to deliberately vote this down because Spain have done something about Gibraltar or something. So I appreciate this sort of multi-dimensional chess going on, but it seems to me a good starting point.
Yeah.
But the truth is that over the last 4 years.
It can't have been that important. If you vote against something that you actually want, it can't really be that important to you.
That important. So I think it's a good starting point. The interesting thing, really, and this I think makes the future very uncertain, but makes potentially 2021 quite exciting, is we in the UK have been so bogged down in the process of getting Brexit done. And indeed, whether or not we should even get Brexit done. 4.5 years since the referendum, 2 general elections, suggestions that we might go for a second referendum. So it's really all been about the process of divorce, not what we're going to do with our newfound freedom. And just as we might have been getting to the point of, okay, it's now going to happen, we're going to get it over the line, when we had just over a year ago the general election that re-elected the Conservatives with a handsome majority, within weeks we're hit by COVID. So government bandwidth has been really about, let's get the divorce done. Oh my God, there's a pandemic, so that's going to chew up nearly all our efforts. There hasn't yet been a great deal of focus or debate or discussion about what are we going to do with these newfound freedoms. There was, for a short window from like December 2019 to perhaps February 2020, but since then it's been COVID with get Brexit over the line in the background. So in 2021, I think this will come to the fore, and there's a fair chance. I mean, it would be very odd for Boris Johnson and his Brexity government to say, oh no, I mean, the regulatory framework we're inheriting from the European Union is optimal. It's perfect. It's utopia. There is not one line of it we wish to change, because you'd have to scratch your head and say, well, if the European Union's that good at passing regulations, why on earth did you want to leave? So almost for sort of symbolic and political reasons, I think they're going to have to change some of the inherited stock.
Do you
but
think,
to my mind, the big gains are still on the flow.
Do you think 1 in 2 out could, or maybe 1 in 3 out, or something like that, could also be a sort of principle to use to get something done on getting rid of regulation? As you're saying, it's a sort of minute type of thing, and with each individual paragraph, you can always have an argument for, well, this is not so bad, or actually this does have a point, or whatever. So I think it's important to have a sort of disciplining, overarching principle going on, and your idea with what we voted against we should get rid of that's one overarching principle. Another would be to say, look, we have an aim of decreasing it by this amount, and the Canadians have certainly been successful at British Columbia at creating a way of counting each individual regulation, and that has worked. They decreased the total degree, the total volume of regulation quite substantially with that rule. Do you think that something like that could happen?
Something like that could happen. I guess my initial strategy of get rid of the stuff that we voted against, so notwithstanding this bizarre idea that we occasionally vote against things we want and vote for things we don't want, shows you how absurd politics is. But my additional thing would be to say, why don't we just say, okay, we're out now, we're leaving at 11 p.m. actually, an hour before the new year comes in. The whole lot, the entire acquis, is sunset claused for 10 years' time. If we have not specifically renewed it in the next decade, it dies. Now, there might be bits of it that we wish to specifically renew, but the default assumption is it dies in, let's say, 2030. We don't need to do all of this in the next, or 2025, a reasonable period of time for the government bureaucracy to work through the entire list of regulations and decide whether they believe it important enough to put it back on the table and in the EU regulatory keeping bill, that it would have to be in that bill by 20, otherwise it dies. And there are some extraordinary bits and bobs. I know there's quite a lot of myth making in Britain around some of the more preposterous regulations, but let me give you one which I have had occasion to look into and I believe is true. I haven't consulted lawyers on it, and it's to do with the protection of endangered species. Now, there's a particular type of newt that is by the European Union considered to be an endangered species because of the total land mass of the European Union. It is
a newt. That's a salamander.
Yeah, like a little salamander thing. Yeah, small salamander across the continent, across the European Union as a whole. It is indeed a very rare species. But that's basically because it only exists in the south of England, where it is a pest. but therefore, it's on the, and it is absolutely absurd. I'm even told at Southend Airport, which is a very, very small airport in Britain, there is someone whose job is the newt protection officer. And before any sort of potholes in the tarmac are filled in, this guy's got to come out and make sure that no newt will die in vain. This is not an endangered species. They're any more than pigeons are an endangered species. And the excuse has not been animal welfare. I mean, it's been endangered species. It's just not a rare species. They're essentially a pest in some. I mean, that's clearly the sort of example of. Now, it's not going to revolutionise aviation.
If you can't get rid of that,
yeah.
Then
what's the point?
Yeah, what's the point, right?
Well, I say the point is, even if I couldn't get rid of that, the point is I think we will avoid much of the flow of this in future.
Exactly.
So I think we should work through these absurdities. without any view that, I mean, it would not revolutionise the aviation sector for Southend Airport to no longer have to check for newts. It is a tiny saving. So each of these would be tiny micro savings. None of them would be revolutionary, but I think it's, if you like, almost psychologically important to do this. It would be part and parcel of trying to reframe our approach to regulation, rather than the present affliction right across the Western world that everybody's incentivized in the government bureaucracy to come up with more rules. You're sort of promoted if your rules make it onto the books. One of the highest privileges of a British civil servant is to have passed legislation, not to have repealed it or stopped it. Somehow or other, we need to use this opportunity just to get the dynamics and the incentives pointing in a different direction. That does not mean, Martin, that I can point to you 15 regulations that we are certain to incinerate and to say with my hand on my heart, and this will obviously mean that GDP growth will suddenly be 6% per annum. It won't be like that, but I think there is a chance to reconfigure political and bureaucratic thinking in Britain about what regulation's for, what should you do with the stock of it, how should you cross-examine the stock, should it be sunset clause, should we have 1 in, 2 outs, 1 in, 3 outs, and what principles should govern what regulations we bring in future. All of that is a shot on the board. It might be a shot we miss, but it's a shot that we wouldn't have had if we were not leaving the European Union.
Mark, thank you very much for taking part in my podcast. Happy New Year. Happy
New Year to you, Martin, as well.
Let's do this again when we know a little bit more about the extent to which you've been successful in rethinking regulation in Britain. I'll be following in this, and I really hope that Britain will be successful outside the European Union, although I do miss you already.
Well, that's very kind, but I'm sure we can keep speaking even as tomorrow dawns and I'm no longer an EU citizen at all. It's been a real pleasure being with you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark.